2018 lightweight bodybuilding champion. He's helped hundreds of people get closer to their fitness goals. On today's episode of The School of Muscle, Jack Gadd. All right, Jack. So the first kind of place I'd like to start here is talking about, I know you've kind of talked about in the past, is some people when they're going through a gaining phase, they're not totally happy because they're kind of putting on fat and they just don't feel comfortable. And then they switch it to a cutting phase and they're also not really happy because they're not eating as much food. Maybe they're more tired. Maybe they feel small. So could you kind of speak to like your experience with that and how you kind of might handle that?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the biggest issue for the reasoning behind this is, like you said, people don't enjoy putting on fat. Let's be honest, no one enjoys that part of gaining. We love the part where we get stronger in the gym. We love the part where we've got more energy, but we don't love the part where we put on fat. So it's accepting that is part of the process, and that is something that happens in a gaining phase. While obviously we're not going to put on tons and tons of fat, there's no point obviously getting to the point where you're just becoming overweight for the sake of it. There is a limit where you have to accept, okay, I'm going to be carrying a bit more stomach fat than normal. When I take my top off, I'm probably not going to have abs. But if you're doing that in the pursuit of being better in the long run, that's what you've got to keep reverting it back to. You've got to revert back to what your long-term goals are. And I think that's why a lot of people, they get caught up in the trap of going into a cut, going into a bulk, and they just switch between these phases all the time because they forget about what the long-term goal is. It's very easy for me, obviously, because my long-term goal is to get to be kind of the best natural bodybuilder I can. I'd love to be a pro one day. I'm not like saying I want to be it in 2020 or 2021. It's kind of a goal that's in the future. But I know for me to get to that stage, I've got to put on weight. I've got to obviously go through gaining phases and accept that being in that is progressive to where I want to be in my future goals. So I think that's one of the main things, is just accepting why you're doing it and if it's something that you're working towards long term. Like, just as an example, I've got clients that don't enjoy gaining phases, and we don't really tend to put them through it because their goal isn't actually to be more muscular. They love being leaner. They love the way it makes them feel. So I think sometimes people get caught up in the fact that they have to do it when sometimes they don't. If they just enjoy being lean, maintaining that body weight, then sometimes that's the best thing for them. And I think just really finding out what your long-term goal is and then accepting those phases is really going to help you whatever phase you go through.
Totally. And I think that often a lot of coaches might even put their own goals onto their clients and almost almost say like, hey, you have to do X, when in reality, you really have to understand, what is your client's goal? Is their goal just to be generally lean and healthy and active, or is their goal to like put on as much muscle as possible?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think we've definitely all got caught up in that before, where you've got to do this gaining phase, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing that. And you've got to realize that it's your client who's going through this. It's not you. Like you said, putting your goals onto them because you think that's the right thing to do might not be the best thing to do for that client. And everyone is individual. And if you're wondering whether you feel you need to be in a gaining phase, I think you've got to look at your goals. And if your goal is to build muscle, if your goal is to potentially be leaner later in life but have a bigger frame, you will have to go through that stage of obviously accepting the gaining phase. You're going to be a bit more heavier, a bit kind of fluffier around the sides, and just that's part of the process, really.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, it can be tough putting on that little bit of fat and wanting to pull back. And I think it can be especially hard like at the start of a phase, because like when you're pretty lean and then you just kind of transition into, I mean, if you're really lean and you first transition, you kind of fill out and you look awesome. But as you kind of go, your perception of how lean you are is just kind of really skewed, you know?
Yeah, it lasts for about, I think, 3 or 4 weeks. And then you really get going into your gaining phase, and you've gone past that stage of being full and being pumped, and it's kind of like you see the abs fade in, the weight scales go up a lot quicker. So yeah, obviously, like in 2015 when I first prepped, I really struggled quite mentally, like with just gaining weight. And it took me, it must have took about 7 months to recover from my prep, because I was so afraid of gaining weight. And it was just like, it just took longer than it really needed to be. Whereas this time around, like, admittedly, I've probably gained a little too fast, but I feel great. and lifts of like, I'm back to my off season lifts and I'm lighter. So it's just like, it's because I've been through that stage of acceptance, and I spent a lot of time in my off season liking that physique. It wasn't hard to go from being like in my prep shredded sort of physique to now where I am, obviously a bit fluffier and everything. So like, I think it's just spending time and accepting that, enjoying both sides. So enjoy the cutting physique, enjoy the gaining physique, and enjoy it for what it is. When you cut, you look shredded in the gym when you're training, it's great. But you're fatigued and everything. And when you're gaining, you've got more choice to go out with friends. You can go out for dinner. Your lifting is amazing because you're lifting PBs every week. So it's just enjoying and accepting those phases for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the experience aspect of it, actually going through it, is like one of the biggest things, because like you can listen to a podcast and hear that, oh, play the long game and do this, do that. But when it comes down to it, after experiencing it, it really kind of changes your perspective with things.
For sure. I think that's probably one of the main reasons why so many people don't ever get going with it, because they never give it the chance that it needs to be. So you'll see like 1 or 2 month gaining phases or 1 or 2 month cutting phases, and it never really gets going to a point where it gets fun. And it takes a little while for it to get fun. Like you probably know, like the first stages of a cut are not that exciting, because you just tend to lose a lot of water, you tend to lose a lot of glycogen. You're not really losing massive amounts of fat straight away. And it's the same with a gaining phase. Like straight away, it's quite good because your lifts are going up. But as you get really deep into it, there's so much that goes on, and with PBs and the gym, and you can just lift more, and it's a lot more fun. So I think just giving it a chance is one of the biggest things. Like just give those phases a chance to really get going.
For sure. I think there's something to be said for like gaining some momentum on both sides of it, kind of getting in the rhythm of into a cut, and also getting into the rhythm of a gaining phase. And I really like how you brought up how like the first few weeks of a cut, actually, they're not that great, because like
you're terrible.
You're getting used to the calorie deficit. It's like, okay, this kind of sucks. And then on the flip side, you don't look really awesome because you still kind of might have that body fat, and then you're just kind of depleted, and it's just not a great time.
That's it. 'Cause you've gone from this like you're full of glycogen, your training's great, to then you've dropped all the carbs and everything. So you're now obviously like getting like kind of depleted as such. You don't look as full when you're training, and there's not much fat that's come off. So you've kind of just like, you look really bad straight away, but as you then start tapping into more fat stores and everything, you look better week on week. But it's just giving the chance, obviously, straight away, instead of just going back to gaining when you feel a bit crap about your cutting phase.
Right. And of course, that's like our perception of it too, because like if someone was like just generally in the general public and saw somebody in their first few weeks of dieting, where the person dieting probably feels like they are, depleted and stuff like that. But on the outside, someone looking in, they probably couldn't notice like significant changes, but just having that, that relation to what you've been in the past can kind of mix that up a little bit.
Yeah, no, 100%. No, I agree massively.
So do you find that someone's like perception of how fat they are changes quite a bit after going through a dieting phase? And do you think that can kind of hold them back a little bit when they kind of go into a gaining phase?
Yeah, for sure. I think your first diet you do will always set you up for, I guess, never really being too content, whatever you do with your gaining phases, because it's like you get to this stage with your physique, and it's like you've been maintaining it for months. You've got leaner for like 3 or 4 or 5 months, and it's now a case of you start to put weight back on. You don't know any different because you've built that habit of looking like that for so long. You've probably taken daily posing photos. You've probably looked at yourself in the gym every single day, and you've got veins coming out of your arms and your legs, and it's like, this is amazing. To then suddenly going away from it is a really difficult thing to grasp. Like just accepting that going away from it is obviously like, it's not fun, but again, it's bringing it back to that long-term goal of, if you do want to start building muscle, coming away from that is one of the best things for it. And I think a lot of people's perceptions are skewed by how they look at themselves at different times of the day as well. Like I'll have a conversation with people who say they don't enjoy the way they look because they've walked past the mirror and they've they've just ate a massive meal, they've just had a big drink of water, and they're bloated, and that's natural. Like, you're gonna look bloated if you're not doing a side tricep in the mirror, if you're just standing there with your belly out. So I think a lot of people's perceptions are kind of skewed by not getting regular updates to how they look as well, in the same lighting, in the same kind of situation. I think that's one of the biggest things people need to do more of, so they can actually see what they properly look like.
Right. And do you like to use like photos and stuff like that kind of over time to kind of track that as well?
Yeah, for sure. I like to, so for gaining phases, like, I tend to do photos like every 3 or 4 weeks, because I think if you get into the habit of looking at yourself every day or every week, you know probably as well as I do, there's not much changes going on in like a week. So it's actually nicer just waiting, kind of giving yourself a bit of momentum, checking every 3 or 4 weeks when there's probably been more drastic changes to look at in your physique. And in a gaining phase, again, like from like month 1 to say month 4 or 5, it can be difficult to actually see the changes you've made, because fat does obviously kind of get rid of our kind of exception on what we look like. But if we can save those changes and look later on instead of like looking weekly, we'll probably have more drastic things to look at, as well as things like measurements as well. If your lifts are going up, that's another sign that you're obviously growing muscle as well. So there's loads of different signs apart from the look that obviously we are growing, for sure.
And is there any like specific measurements that you like to use with yourself and clients, like during the off season?
So I kind of stick to the basics, really. I just obviously pictures, actual measuring tapes as well. So checking like girth measurements, things like chest, shoulders, arms, and thigh. And then obviously just looking at our lifts, seeing if clothes feel tighter, that potentially that weren't kind of hugging your chest and shoulders in your cut, but now obviously you're gaining, they're potentially a bit tighter. So clothes is another brilliant measurement. Like, I always get feedback from clients say my jeans are a lot tighter than they were 4 weeks ago around my quad area, and that's a good sign that they're growing a little bit on their quads as well, potentially glutes getting bigger as well. So there's all these things which lead up to a bigger picture, instead of just thinking about, oh, I'm putting on a little bit of fat. You need to look at every kind of variable and measurement you can to make a good judgment call on it.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, I've tended to look the most at their photos over time, because I feel like sometimes I'll have a client that, you know, they're like, hey, my squat really didn't move a whole lot these last few weeks, but in their photos, you can perfectly see that their legs have improved. I'm like, well, our goal here is to improve the way we look. So, you know, our literal outcome measure is our photos and how we're looking. So I'm a little bit biased towards looking at the photos over the performance, but like you said, looking at all these variables together, like if your waist circumference isn't skyrocketing, if your performance is increasing, if you're looking better, then we're pretty sure we're hitting on all cylinders.
That's it, exactly that. And when it comes to obviously looking at your lifting progress as well in a gaining phase, if your squat has stalled for 3 or 4 weeks, but your leg press, your deadlift, your leg extension, your leg curls, they have all flown up, that's probably a reason for why they look bigger in the picture. So it's, again, not obsessing on one single thing, and look at everything which leads to a bigger picture in overall.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd be curious to kind of how you tend to approach a gaining phase, maybe for yourself or for somebody they are that person that really wants to kind of maximize how much muscle they can put on. Like, how do you approach like rates of gain and things like that in an off season?
Yeah, for sure. So rates of gain is anywhere from around about 2 to 4 pounds. It really depends sort of how lean I am and where I kind of am with my physique. So if I'm a bit on the fluffier side and going a bit too fast, I'll probably scale that back a little bit, and we'll go with the lower end, like the kind of £2 per month. Or if I'm sort of, again, just coming out of a prep or just coming out of a diet, I tend to gain a little bit faster because you can get away with it. And I think you can get back to those kind of numbers which you were hitting previously quicker. In terms of my approaches, I'll start with obviously nutrition. So nutrition approaches, I go a little bit higher with protein. And this is mainly because carbs are coming up. The reason behind this, obviously, when you're trying to get 550, 600 grams of carbs in, and you're only on 170, 180 grams of protein, realistically, how much of that is coming from good quality sources? That's one of the biggest things that I feel probably a lot of people don't do in their off season because of this whole 1 gram per pound rule, which is great. And I obviously use that a lot, but it has its context for different things. We need to think about, is the protein you're getting in from your carb sources like bagels and wraps and pasta really the protein that is going to help with obviously getting in the good amounts of quality that you need? Mm-hmm. So again, that's kind of like one of my nutrition approaches. What I often do as well is I won't stress too much if daily macros aren't exact. So for example, I tend to hit like a protein and a calorie goal instead of like stressing about protein, carbs and fats, because it's that thing. You diet for such a long time, 5-6 months, and you've been like meticulous with your calories and your macros for that long, to then going into a gaining phase. I think you should be allowed some form of flexibility. As long as your training's still going well and you are recovering, that's one of the two main factors, I think, which can allow you to hit that protein and calorie requirement. And it just it gives you less stress, I think, instead of worrying about it. Like you probably know, if you're trying to hit 500-600 grams of carbs, it's so annoying just trying to figure out what to eat in the day. So I'd rather just hit protein and calories and be a bit more flexible and those kind of things. And then in regards to training, so training wise, just handle more volume. I can do so much more than I can in a deficit for obvious reasons. I've got more energy. My central nervous system doesn't get as battered as much. So I can do like AMRAPs or top sets on deadlifts and squats, and it doesn't affect me as much as it would do in a prep or a diet. So there's all these things with training which I can just tend to do more, obviously within reason. I'm not just going to do loads for the sake of it, but I can recover faster. Training wise, I can just do more sets, which obviously allows for obviously greater progress as well.
I think those make a lot of sense, really sensible approaches. And as for the hitting like protein and calories, like when you are like dieting for so long and you're restraining yourself, just having those constraints can be stressful and fatiguing in itself. So I think that loosening up those reins is really helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. I think people don't give themselves enough kind of flexibility, and they sometimes are a bit too rigid when it's not needed as much. I understand obviously hitting your macros as close as you can each day is probably going to be more beneficial, but I don't see any reason why you can't just hit a protein and a calorie amount. Obviously don't go stupidly high with fats, but if you can't just hit a protein and a calorie amount, and if your training is going well and you're still recovering, then I see that as fine in my opinion. And it just gives you more flexibility with life, which a gaining phase should be about. You should be able to enjoy life more. You should be able to go out for dinner. You should be able to, let's just say, let your partner cook you a lasagna without having to use low-fat cheese and low-fat sauce, so it doesn't take you over your fat requirement.
Yeah, for sure. It opens up that flexibility to make this more so a part of our life rather than just kind of taking it over, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
I'd be curious on how you kind of approach your training like progression. So some people are more so very similar volume and just kind of focus on getting stronger, whereas other people are more so, let's kind of ramp up volume across the mesocycle, deload, and kind of wash things out. So what's kind of your approach with that?
Yeah, for sure. So I kind of like use the best bits of everyone, really. I don't really have my own way of doing things exactly the way. Like I use things like obviously reps and reserve for most of my stuff, and I use things like AMRAPs, I use things like failure sets. I'll use like a mix of everything to make up my program. So in terms of like progression over a mesocycle, what I tend to do is I don't change sets too much. So I'll set my sets to roughly around about a minimum, maximum amount, which will help me progress. And then when I find that I'm stalling on a movement and potentially load can't be increased much anymore, or I find load progressions are slower, then I'll start to add sets to it. So it makes things a lot more easier, so I can focus on the load progressions. And when I've kind of maxed that out, then I might start adding a little bit more sets each week as they go, and then obviously get to the point where I need a deload because I'm fatigued, and then we'll kind of re-go again. So, and I think that's one of the biggest things a lot of people don't give themselves the chance is to maximize the load they can do on the bar, maximize the amount of dumbbells they can use. because they just add sets for the sake of it, because they think that's obviously going to help with increasing volume, which obviously it will. But when we look at the quality of the set, how we can perform it, if we can do more load, realistically, I think that's going to help more in the long run than just doing loads of junk volume for the sake of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's the tricky thing with adding volume across a mesocycle is I think it can soon become far less quality volume. And that's something that I've caught myself with too, is I would find myself in like week 1 of my mesocycle where volumes are lower. I'm really focusing on that contraction and really making it high quality volume. And then in week 4, when I have like 5 sets for a single exercise or something like that, it's almost like I'm sandbagging a little bit until those final sets. And it just makes me question whether I'm taking the best approach there.
That's it. And you see a lot of people, they do these like kind of 2 working sets to absolute failure. I don't really tend to like that approach because I personally don't think that's enough volume. I think there is a limit between how much you can do, and potentially then you're just doing too much to failure as well, which is then just going to bring on a bucket load of fatigue as well. So it's just all about being clever with how much sets you can get away with before it starts becoming poor quality. Like you said, when you've got 5 sets on a bench press and you get to the 4th and 5th set and the weight has to reduce drastically because you can't get the reps out anymore, then you kind of question whether those sets are really worth it. So it's being clever about your volume, adding where necessary to keep progressing over the course of a mesocycle.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense. So your kind of basic approach is more so, all right, let's kind of hang out at this volume level and really try to progress load. When things kind of stall out, then we might increase volume a little bit. Then if we get to the point to where, okay, we're just doing a little bit too much here, fatigued, then you take the deload.
Yeah. Usually it depends on obviously other factors, whether people need a deload or whether I feel like everything is kind of needing a deload as such. So yeah, that's pretty much the basic approach I take with everything. And I can, especially in an off season, I can get to that stage where I can add a rep to everything each week, or I can add a little bit of load. So it's not too difficult, as obviously I push body weight up, to make progress every week. I certainly don't find that anyway. I don't know whether about yourself, whether you are the same, like as your food comes up, you find that your training is just very, very progressive on its own without needing to add sets.
So I kind of follow more of an approach to where I do accumulate volume across a mesocycle, but I mean, I'm still shooting for that balance to where it's not so much to where it's not quality and stuff like that. But I find that mine kind of comes in spurts to where I'll gain some weight and things will kind of be stalled a little bit. And then just like 3 weeks in a row, it'll be PR. And then things will kind of stall for a little bit. And then the same thing will kind of happen. At least that's how it works out for me. Yeah,
no, it's pretty similar for me. Like in terms of sets accumulating, again, it's just a case of adding them when I feel necessary. Sometimes I will just add for a lot of different things, which I know will recover well. Things like shoulders and lateral raises, I know I can add a lot of that on because it doesn't build up much fatigue like adding loads of sets to quads would. But I know if I just added sets and sets each week to my quads, I would just be battered. And by the time I get to week 3, I think I probably need a deload anyway.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm a fan of adding sets, especially to the muscle groups that seem to have a little bit like less strength increased potential. So maybe for like your biceps, your medial delts, like you said, your rear delts. I'm a big fan of using kind of volume as a tool for overload for those muscles. Have you kind of found the same?
Yeah, definitely. Like especially like things that just like can recover very easy, like biceps. Like you said, medial delts, lateral delts, like they just tend to recover so quickly compared to anything else. So you can get away with adding a lot more there. Like I know myself and a few clients who've been upwards of like 20 sets on on their delts in their training cycles because they can progress. And if you can, and you can add more sets and still do the quality volume. And I think that's something I want to come back to is as long as the quality of the volume isn't affected and the sets are still good, they're actually good quality, then that's fine.
And is there anything like specifically that you think about to gauge whether your volume is quality or not?
So I think it depends on kind of the last couple reps I get out. Like if I feel that I'm getting towards, let's say we've got a set of 8 to 10 and I'm getting to like the 8th rep, and the form on it starts to go and it just doesn't feel as good, the pump isn't as good on it, then I'll sort of assess whether that's actually quality or not, because I think those are kind of one of the best indicators for me is, am I actually really feeling this muscle work as well? Like when you've done like your 4th or 5th set on a row and you put the bar down and you can't feel your back or you can't feel your lats, then you've got to really think, is that quality work? Are you actually doing what you should be there?
For sure. And I think that's kind of a very similar gauge that I use. It almost feels like I'm just kind of pushing the weight up and down rather than actually moving the weight with my muscle, if that makes any sense. So
yeah, no, it does. It's weird to describe, but it does make a lot of sense. People probably listen and will be like, what do you mean? But when you kind of think about using the muscle, you bring on this whole load of mind muscle connection, which you probably never had there before.
Right, for sure. And do you plan your deloads out ahead of time, like before a mesocycle, or do you kind of auto regulate them like reactively, or how do you kind of approach deloads?
So I've got like a bit of a rough approach. I know that usually they fall around about the 6 to 9 week mark. I know that's quite a big variance, but it really depends kind of like, I guess, what's going on in your life as well, because that can really affect when you need to deload, depending on your work life, your job and everything. But yeah, I don't like set a date on it. And the reason why I don't do this, because let's just say I've got a client who's coming up to their 6th week of training, and they absolutely blitz their training week. They're feeling fantastic, but they're due for a deload on the 7th week. You're kind of just stopping the momentum. And I think stopping the momentum is probably not the best thing to do, because there's more potential for more progress if you can just keep going. And when I start to see signs of it, that's usually when I call it, because there's this fine line, and I see it all the time, of going too far gone with it, to then the point you start get injured, you start to pick niggles up, training takes a drastic drop in performance. So it's really just timing how the fatigue is, how training performance is going before really calling the deload. But yeah, I never really have like a dead stop, you must deload on the 6th week or 7th week. It's really, we just look at training and see how it's going, and then we'll take the deload when required, really.
Okay, cool. So if momentum is going, they're making progress, things are going well, you're kind of like, all right, let's just keep rolling with this. But then if they're kind of like, some fatigue's popping up, I'm not totally sure if I could make it through another week, then you're like, all right, then this is a good point to kind of call it.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think you, as a coach as well, coming back to this, if you're getting clients that are feeling great on their, let's say 9th, 10th, 11th week, there's things you need to be looking at. You need to be looking at how they're performing those reps and how they're performing those sets, because we know as coaches, the volume that we can see on our sheets is probably enough to get you to be needing a deload at whatever day it falls on. If they're then going 4 or 5 weeks past that because they're feeling great, then there's something else you need to be looking at, and looking at the intensity of the lift as well. So that again falls into play, I think, a lot.
For sure. I know I've had a client in the past where it was like they're their final week of their mesocycle and they were programmed to do like 20 sets for their quads or something. So like a crap ton. And after that, they were still like, oh, my quads didn't get sore or anything like that. I was like, all right, man, let's see what these exercises are actually looking like, and let's see what's kind of going on here. And yeah, that was kind of funny. So
I think one of the best things to do as well is schedule like AMRAPs in the last week as well, because that gives you a good idea, like not only as a coach, but yourself as well, what your parameters of failure are. Because let's just say you've done like 140 for 6 on a back squat for however many weeks, and then you do your last set of an AMRAP and you get 10 or 11, I think that's a good indicator that potentially normally you're not pushing yourself as hard as you could be. So that is another good way of obviously just kind of like showing to yourself that you're hitting the right kind of reps in reserve and the right RP for your workouts as well.
Totally. I think there's a lot of value in having somewhere in there taking a set to like all out to see what you can do, because you know, especially on like squats and things like that, it's almost like you can almost always get that one more rep, and then
for sure,
6 reps later you're like, holy crap, have I been sandbagging this entire mesocycle? So
been doing an RP 3 for 6 weeks.
Apparently. So all right, cool. So I think that kind of covers your approach to like gaining and massing phases pretty well. So I'd kind of like to shift it to kind of a cutting phase. And I'm curious to where Your training, well, I guess it probably depends on the extent of the cutting phase, but I'll just kind of let you roll with your training. Do you kind of immediately cut volume for that, like just right off the bat, or kind of how do you approach your training when kind of transitioning to a cutting phase?
Yeah, so I think it depends obviously what kind of cutting phase it is, like, and how big the deficit is to start off with. So for example, like a mini cut, which is obviously in out, very aggressive deficit, trading will drop in terms of volume. There'll be a lot of volume that will drop down because obviously, as you know, when you go on mini cut, you would just accumulate a lot of fatigue because of the deficit you're now in. So you need to drop volume to allow for that, and I think you can get away with it as well. Like I don't tend to program a lot of metabolite work in things like mini cuts. I just tend to just stick training to what would be a maintenance amount, because realistically, we're not growing in this mini cut. We're not eating enough to grow, so we don't. I wouldn't say we need to do the same amount of volumes as we would do when we're trying to grow. So we can get away with maintaining. If I was starting off, I guess, more of a smaller cut, again, it's just tapering it to suit how big the deficit is and how much they're losing. I think at the start of any kind of cut, if you're doing it slowly, you can probably still get away with what you were doing in your off-season volumes. And then as the prep goes on and you lose more and more body fat, you will need to adjust that down. Like, because I know myself with like when I first started, training was great. I was still increasing my lifts each week. I was still getting new numbers in the gym, which I hadn't before in the first stage of my diet. But after the first mesocycle, that's when volume needed to drop quite a lot because fatigue just built up faster than I knew. And I couldn't get away with what I used to before. So yeah, it does come down quite drastically to what I feel I can usually do in an off season, for sure. I'm sure you probably know that as well with yourself.
Yep, for sure. Definitely aligns well with my experience. It's like the kind of that the first few weeks, first 3 to 5, 6 weeks of a diet, it's kind of like you're still riding that momentum of a gaining phase, especially if you went through like a nice extended gaining phase and you're actually in a really good position to go through a cutting phase. Then you kind of ride that momentum. And then after time, it's just kind of like, okay, this volume's kind of unsustainable. And I think some people might get caught up in thinking that they can't decrease their volume at all on a cutting phase because they're like, if I decrease volume, I'll lose muscle. Have you ever kind of ran into any of that with yourself?
Yeah, for sure. No, I've seen that quite a bit, to be honest. Like, they worry because they're not doing as much as they were doing before. Like, let's say they were doing 4 sets on squats, now they're only doing 3. They think, okay, am I doing less? Does that mean I'm now potentially going to be losing a lot of the muscle? But it's then just reiterating that the volumes that they were doing then was to help them grow. And obviously we can use these, obviously MAV and everything, and that, like, minimum effective dose and volume to make sure that they are still maintaining what they have built, and just reiterating that to them, that you're not going to lose muscle with what you're doing as long as you're doing the right things and getting enough protein in, making sure you're recovering, making sure your load is staying on the bar. And I think that's one of the biggest things to kind of explain to them is, now they're doing less sets, focus on keeping the load where they can on their lifts. And I think that's one of the best things going forward, is making sure they know that that is what's going to obviously help them maintain their muscle throughout as well.
Right. And especially considering like it's not going to be productive for them to try to keep doing those volumes because they're soon going to find themselves in an under recovered state. Their performance is probably going to be plummeting a bit. And that's definitely not a good recipe for maintaining muscle mass and things like that. Yeah,
exactly. And it comes back to that thing as well. Like, if you've got 4 or 5 sets to do on squats, which you would easily annihilate in an off season, it's a very demanding task in a cut. And I've experienced it as well. Like, I tried to keep with my deadlifts this year, or last year, sorry, when I prepped. I was lifting a very heavy amount for my body weight at that time, and I tried to keep up with the sets, tried to keep up with the load, and all it did was just, it fried me. Like, my central nervous system was just not happy at the end of every session, and I just go home and I just need to sleep because I was just so tired and I was just so knackered from that session. And again, it's just, you have to make these sacrifices. I think, like, you can try and keep hold of your your volume and your weight as much as possible, but there will definitely come a time where I think you need to reintroduce these lighter loads, potentially that are a bit more of a back off, to allow for you to not be as knackered all the time, not so like, because when you go into your sessions, if you're tired and if you are feeling absolutely like just in the gutters, you're not going to have a good session. So it is really kind of a weighing up amount of how much you can get away with, but then not to fatigue yourself too much as well.
Yep, for sure. There's always that fine line there to where you don't want to be like, okay, I'm cutting now, I should reduce all my volume, all my sets, and my weight on the bar and everything like that. No, we still want to maintain our strength. We're still working here. We're still keeping our muscle and things like that. But we also need to take a look at, hey, if we're doing too much here to where we can't maintain performance, we can't recover, then it's not going to help either.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people forget how much they've lost as well. I see it a lot with a couple clients who are like 20, 30 pounds lighter, and they're really annoyed with themselves that they can't lift what they were when they were 30 pounds heavier. And it's just, again, like reminding them and reminding yourself that you're not that weight anymore. So you're realistically probably not going to be able to lift that kind of load you were when you were that much heavier, and your leverages were a lot better as well. So there's all these things to consider.
For sure. And something that I've found is helpful is like kind of looking at relative strength and how strong you are per pound of body weight for a certain lift.
Yeah, for sure.
Often that will actually increase quite a bit during like a deficit. You'll be pretty dang strong for your body weight. And if you, even though like the absolute load's going to be a little bit lower and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like I think we all forget that, don't we? We forget like being, let's say you started a diet at 200 pounds and you were benching 100 kilos, and let's say you're 6 or 7 weeks in and you're 190 and you're still doing the same. Like that's epic. That's really good to be able to still be doing that. So it's, again, just appreciating when you are like in the depths of a diet and it's getting near towards the end, you will probably be a bit weaker, but it's just one of those things. And don't then go back into a gaining phase because you're weaker. Finish off that diet.
Exactly, or else you'll be caught in that little cycle again. So
100%.
Something that I've found that for myself, it's kind of helped. My clients haven't really said this at all, but for myself, using a little bit more exercise variation in a dieting phase seems to just kind of, it might just all be mental to where it just kind of helps out. Like if I only do like 2 or 3 sets per exercise rather than the off season, I might go a little bit higher, and using a little bit more exercise variation seems to help. Have you found anything similar to that in your experience?
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, definitely, for sure. I think if you're giving yourselves more exercises to play with, it increases the enjoyment factor as well, I think, as well. And again, I think it comes down to that point of, I think people can get mentally tired of doing loads and loads of sets on an exercise. So the motivation kind of mid-set, or like when you're doing those sets, can drop a little bit, which can cause you to not the quality just not be as good. So having the variation split up a little bit. So let's say for chest, you would normally do an incline dumbbell press for, I don't know, 4 or 5 sets in an off season. If you can split that up between 2 or 3 sets and then moving on to an incline machine press and just giving the chance for a bit of variation, it would definitely help 100%.
Totally. I've definitely found that in my experience for sure. And I'd be curious to kind of how you approach, like, at some point during a deficit, you're probably going to hit a point to where, all right, we need to increase this calorie deficit a little bit more. We probably either need to move more, burn more calories through our energy expenditure, or eat less food. So I'd be kind of curious on what's kind of your approach to either doing a little bit of cardio or eating less food.
Yeah, this is a good one because for me, I would always go calories. Okay. And this is because I'm quite happy to save my where I expend to do my workouts. I would always go for calories and steps, but this is going to vary massively, I think, on your lifestyle, your job, everything that comes with it. So let's just take this scenario. You've got kids, and you still want to carry on getting leaner. You've got to be home to obviously cook the dinner, put them to bed. Realistically, can you do 30, 40, 50 minutes of cardio a day on top of your step count, on top of your day job? So it's just, I think it's making those commitments and those kind of those choices where it's going to be easier for you. And for me, I just think calories, taking them lower, if you can handle I think that's the easiest approach personally. Hitting a step goal and hitting a calorie amount is definitely, I feel, an easier approach. And you see it a lot with people who just slam cardio every single day as well. They often just run flat, and you just look flat every single day. And I don't know. I see it a lot of myself. I see it a lot of others as well. I don't know whether you see the same, like when you slam the Stairmaster, or even like doing excess amount of steps, like 25,000 plus a day, can cause like your quads just to not have that pop as they normally would, as if you were kind of creating a deficit from somewhere else. So that's just my anecdotal experience looking at it from others and myself as well. So
yeah, and I'm totally on board with that. I am lean far more towards reducing calories, because I think at some point you're probably going to adapt to the cardio you're doing and stuff like that, and compensate for your energy expenditure with that as well. So that becomes a pretty inefficient way, in my opinion, to increase that calorie deficit rather than just eating a little bit less. And sometimes I'll see where they'll be doing so much cardio to where they'll have to like bring down their volume for their legs and stuff like that. And I'm just like, man, I would much rather keep that volume in for my legs and then just eat a little bit less food, in my opinion, anyways.
Yeah, I think I can't remember who said this, but it brings me back to the point. I think we're not endurance athletes, so realistically, we need to prioritize our training, and that should be the number one priority. And if you're doing, I don't know, hours cardio in the Stairmaster a day, and you find your squat is reducing massively, your leg press is reducing massively, you can only do one set of leg extensions before you can't move your legs anymore. Like, you need to add like all of these factors up and think, is it worth doing all of that cardio? Because if you can't realistically lift what you were in with your leg sessions, and you can't do those volumes and you can't handle them, that's when you start getting into the realms of muscle loss, personally, I feel, with that. And again, like, it's easier to take away 100 calories off of your diet and manipulate your hunger and your volume of food than it is to give, let's say, 700 calories of cardio a week. So it's all these factors which come into play, I think, which just choosing which ones makes it best for you, with obviously in the realms.
Yeah, totally. And you mentioned volume of food there, and sometimes I feel like people can almost set themselves up for kind of a bit of a disaster if they get a little bit too carried away with the food volumes, where they're having like a head of lettuce at every single meal or something like that. Like myself in the past, I know I've had like massive salads with like artificial sweeteners on the salads, and just getting ridiculous with artificial sweeteners and stuff like that. And then after a diet, when you start eating more and you start introducing more of these foods, it's almost like you've set yourself up like a competitive eater that's like expanded their stomach and is just like ready to go ham on it. Have you noticed anything like that with yourself, and to be a little bit more reasonable with food volume and stuff like that?
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest issue starts when you do that in day one of the diet.
Yeah.
So day one of the diet begins, you're on quite a high amount of food anyway, but you're using like 10 calorie jelly, you're using artificial sweeteners, you're having a salad with every meal. Like, realistically, do you need that? I think using those tools when we need to is going to be very, very advantageous to you. Like for me, I found I think it was about 8 weeks out from my first show. That's when I needed to start introducing more of these volume foods. Like I started to have things like protein ice cream, which was really, really filling. Again, I'd have like half a head of lettuce with every meal.
Yeah.
But I think it's using those tactics when it needs to be used, and realizing, I guess, when your hunger is actually needing to be satisfied, because you've probably experienced it as well. Like you eat your first meal and it like opens up the floodgates. Like you're just then continuously hungry. So if you can save that first meal for later in the day, not like taking an intermittent fasting approach, but if you normally eat breakfast at 7, wait till 11. So that's 3 hours out of the day, which you now have missed an eating window, which is going to help with hunger. So it's just choosing when to start eating, I think, is the biggest thing as well in prep, because it does. You eat and then it's like, when's the next meal?
Yep, for sure. I think that if you're already like fasted, it's kind of like you're used to it and it's not bad at all. But then you start having some of that food and then it just gets the ball rolling for sure.
No, for sure. And when it comes to things like artificial sweeteners and everything, like I'm an advocate of them. I don't go against them. I always use like the flavor drops in things like Greek yogurt. I was using like diet drinks as well whenever needed to, but obviously within moderation with everything. I wasn't having a can of Diet Coke between every meal. I'd have like 2 a day and limit it to that. And it didn't affect me in any way of getting leaner. It just helped. Like, I think if you can use anything that helps the process, then that's fine. You don't need to be hardcore about it. At the end of the day, you're choosing to diet so you can make it as easy as you like. Like, it doesn't need to be hardcore. You can add sauces to your meals. You can use artificial sweeteners. It's fine. Just make it as easy as you can for yourself, because that's the easiest thing.
Yep, for sure. And I really like the approach of kind of saving those as like almost as final bullets in the gun, to where you don't come straight out of the gates eating all the lettuce and all the artificial sweeteners. If you can just kind of, all right, I'm now in my last few weeks of my diet. Now I'm going to kind of open things up a little bit more for myself and use some of these more food volume and artificial sweeteners as tools to kind of curb this hunger.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like cardio as well. That's a tool. You don't use that straight out the gates. You use it when you need to get going with things. You want to increase your deficit. That's when you use that. It's the same with the food, like the food choices. Don't use it straight out the gates. Wait until you feel it's needed to be used and then start introducing it slowly. So, because you don't need 10-calorie jelly in week 1 of the diet.
Yep, for sure. And I'd be kind of the last thing on dieting I want to cover here is, how do you kind of approach like refeeds, diet breaks, and things like that in a dieting phase? Do you kind of plan them out ahead of time, or what's kind of your approach there?
Yeah, so I don't really plan them. In terms of planning them, I think it depends how the diet goes, because you could probably plan a diet break after your first training block. But if in that training block someone has had an off week or they've had a meal out and that's took them well over their calories, like, do they then need that diet break if they earned it? I think these things definitely need to be earned. And sometimes I think a lot of people just use them as the excuse of using it because it's known to use them, because that's the thing to do. But if you've got body fat to lose and you need to keep going and you feel good, and again, this is going to come down to how you're feeling as well and whether you need a refeed, sometimes just keeping on with the deficit you're going and just seeing if you can keep handling it. But actually using diet breaks, I like them at the first stages of a diet. I don't like them towards the end. And this is because I feel a week away from fat loss is probably not warranted. But at the start, to make fat loss a lot easier and to give yourself that bit of a break, cool, like diet breaks are great. But as we get towards the end, I prefer refeeds, and mainly because it gives me an idea of how my physique looks after a day of carbs as well, especially like when you know you're going to step on stage. If you've had a refeed at 4 weeks out or say you've had a 2-day refeed at 4 weeks out, you've had like 500 grams of carb meals and the next morning you look amazing. It gives you a good idea of how you can enter peak week as well. So there's all these things which gives me a bit more info. Whereas with a diet break, I just don't like it towards the end because it's just too much away from fat loss. So I don't know what your approach is, whether you feel the same or not.
Yeah, so I kind of see two different approaches to this, where some people make the argument that when you are already pretty dang lean, it's almost like you're about to go underwater and you just want to take a big breath. Like maybe you're around that 8 to 10% body fat. You just take a big breath and then you diet straight through to your show. Maybe you do use a couple refeeds to kind of see how your physique's looking, to really plan that peak week and stuff like that. But I've also heard the argument that the leaner you get, the more your body's going to want to adapt to these negative adaptations that come with dieting. So the more diet breaks you should use. And myself personally, I've never gone through like a 2-year dieting phase just because I was overweight when I was younger. But that was like 3 years ago and I didn't know anything about diet breaks, refeeds and stuff like that. So I've never actually personally used these strategies when being that lean. So I don't have that personal experience, but I'm not sure which approach I might enjoy better.
Yeah, I think like you said, it depends kind of, let's just say you got 8 weeks to your show and you're not lean enough yet. I think there's just an element of a flicking a switch where you just need to say it lightly, but man up and just crack on with it. Just crack on with the deficit and just accept that your calories are going to be low. You're going to probably run flat a little bit as well, which there's nothing wrong with doing that. There's nothing wrong with running a little bit flat. And just accepting that the diet and the deficit, you need to keep that on, and having a refeed will probably not help the process. So, and that was what happened with me. Like I think I was 8 weeks out from my show, stopped refeeds, and we just cracked on with it. It was 1,800 calories for, I think it was like 4 weeks. Then we went to 1,600 calories, and yeah, it sucked, but it depends. It depends what your goal is and how lean you want to be. If you want to be the leanest on stage and you want to be the leanest you've ever been, sometimes you've got to make those sacrifices. I remember, I think it was Cliff Wilson, he posted up some stuff last year. He was like posting up his athletes of how much food they were eating towards the latter stages of their preps. And some of them were on like 1,300 calories, 1,400 calories, and they weren't having refeeds. But they looked incredible on stage. They got to the leanest they'd ever been. It depends on those sacrifices you want to make to get there. Yeah, you can have the easy approach. You can have the diet breaks, feel a little bit better and carry on. But it depends on the time you've got and when you need to be lean for as well. So there's all these factors to consider. And that's why giving yourself enough time is what matters most. What matters most.
For sure. And when you're pushing your body to those extreme levels, sometimes there's not going to be a really great approach. Sometimes you just gotta do it, and you just gotta dive in there and kind of take that somewhat of that hardcore mentality of, I'm just going to get this done.
Yeah, exactly. Just you'll wake up, you'll be tired and you won't feel great. But at the end of the day, if your goal is to step on stage or to be as lean as you can for your photo shoot, sometimes you've got to do what's needed, haven't you? And there's no way to get around it, and there's no kind of special techniques. It's just digging deep and just going after it. And I think that's one of the biggest things people need to take away. And I think in every stage as well, even in gaining phases, just digging deep when needed with your lifts. Same with cutting as well. Just when required, just put your head down and just crack on. And that's one of the biggest things, I think.
For sure. Sometimes you just got to accept that it's embrace the suck and it's what you signed up for, and just get after it.
Sadistically as well, like the suck is kind of good as well, because when you feel horrible and you don't feel good, that's usually a good sign to me that I'm in a deficit and I'm losing body fat. Like sadistically in my head, that's what I think anyway.
Right. Yeah. I totally could see that, where I've had deficits to where I started out and it's like, man, I feel way too good right now. Like I should be feeling this a little bit more. Yeah,
exactly. You see some competitors, I'll say like, I wasn't hungry all prep, but they didn't get lean enough on stage, and that then comes back to yourself. You didn't diet hard enough. So I think being hungry is one of the good signs that you're in a deficit.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Jack, where can people find you online and all that good stuff?
Awesome. So I've got some of my prep series stuff on YouTube. So my YouTube is just Jack Gadd Fitness. I do want to post more on there this year. It's just whether I actually get to doing it. I'd love to, but it's just with obviously coaching and everything, it takes up a lot of the time. And the other best place is Instagram. So that's where I'm most active. So I do a lot on the stories, a lot of posts. And if anyone's got any questions or anything, then just shoot me a DM as well. And that's just Jack Gadd Fitness as well. And again, website is www.jackgaddfitness.com. So it's all Jack Gadd Fitness.
Awesome. It's always nice when you can be nice and consistent across platforms with your name and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Jack.
No problem. I really appreciate you asking me on. It's an absolute honor. And it was great chatting to you as well.
Really hope you guys enjoyed that episode. Make sure to go check out Jack's stuff. Make sure to check out my stuff at ryanjsolomon.com. Screenshot this, put it on your story, and I will see you in that next one.